Hello, everybody. This is James Diboe and Sculpting, dedicated to original peoples as always. And we got a special guest on episode 2, Hakim Adi. How you doing, my brother? Great to have you on, Professor.
I'm doing pretty good. How you doing?
Great, great. Been following a bit of your work. I've seen you involved. You're doing a couple of lectures here and there. Different. You seem like your activity is starting to take off again, or did you have a break before?
It's always, I'm always active.
Okay, okay. Just seem to see you on Instagram more than I usually see you.
No, you may have seen something about the court cases. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I have. Yeah, yeah, definitely. So what's going on with yourself? Anything new going on?
Well, we're pursuing the legal cases. That's I guess new in that there's a big fundraising campaign for 3 legal cases against the University of Chichester. As you said, I'm giving quite a few presentations. I did one at London School of Economics, one at SOAS coming up, one at the University of Exeter coming up, Bernie Grant Memorial Lecture in April coming up. Um,
Excellent.
I'm probably going to start writing a new book pretty soon. Yeah, it's all go, all go
Yeah.
as usual.
Well, nice to see you. Still always there. And yeah. Today we're going to speak on the Black presence in Britain. We briefly spoke on it last time. We spoke on a few different things, but going to try and keep the focus on Black presence in Britain. Now, last time we spoke, yeah, we recognised, of course, the first people we were speaking on Cheddar Man, going back to the 10,000 year period. So we usually, and then I think we worked our way down to Stonehenge, where who actually built Stonehenge? Were the black peoples or were these European peoples? I think we got down to there last time. So if you want to walk us through the Black Prince in Britain.
Well, I can tell you what I've written in my book. And as we said last time, that deals with um, everything from Cheddar Man up to 2020. Um, it looks at all the kind of scientific evidence that we have of one sort or another. And so it looks at, there's a lot of speculation about the African presence in Britain before the Roman period. That's really before our era, more than 2,000 years ago, um, which is anyway difficult to verify. So the book really begins with roughly the Roman period. It makes a few comments about the pre-Roman period, but mainly with the Roman period, which is about 2,000 years ago, and the various archaeological findings that have been done on that period. Of course, that was a period when there was, from written texts, we know that there was an African emperor, Septimius Severus, who's buried at York, uh, a Roman governor from what is today Algeria, and various archaeological finds, of which the most famous is Ivory Bangle Lady, as she's known, a young African woman who's buried in
Yeah,
York. And there are various other, mainly archaeological finds from that period, whether in York, in London, and various other places. So the book discusses those and similar finds from what we'd call the early medieval period, I guess. So that's really from the 6th or 7th century onwards. So that includes, for example, some of the latest discoveries. It's I think the thing to point out is that these days a lot of the research that goes on into archaeological remains is done on the basis of DNA analysis. So looking at DNA helps scientists to be able to establish where somebody came from. and also what they look like, generally speaking. And so reconstructions can be done. Unfortunately, they're not done very often, and that analysis isn't done very often. And so there are a lot of things that we don't yet know. But just to mention one that was done fairly recently, I think about a year ago, from the round about the 7th century, which is of a young girl who's buried not very far from where I live in Kent in southeast England. And that investigation, that analysis showed that her DNA could be traced back to what is today Nigeria, or the region of Nigeria. Of course, Nigeria didn't
I
exist.
think I can remember this discussion we had about, but is it
Yep.
Yoruba possibly?
Yeah, up down girl, she's generally known as. Yeah, she's buried in, or was buried in, a field in Kent. So anyway, if
Yeah,
there are many other examples like that. When I say many, several examples like that, dotted around from that period right up until the late, 15th century, that kind of period.
what's so interesting about that though is like when you think of someone from North Africa, you can see it very close to Europe as well. To someone from Nigeria, this area, or what you're going to call sub-Saharan Africa, to be in Europe that early, this is very interesting. I mean, the last one we did, a couple of my friends of Nigerian descent were very surprised. I mean, I'm not surprised as in because there's a lot of things that we didn't get told, but it shows you like that people have been moving for many, many years.
Yeah, that's right. People moved around. We
Yeah,
don't know how this young girl came to be here. It's likely that she didn't come directly from West Africa. Maybe her father or her grandfather came from there.
okay.
But again, why they came, how they came. Of course, we have to remember again that people traveled from West Africa to North Africa. That wasn't unusual for various reasons, for trade, for other purposes. Um, it's kind of a little bit unusual, but that
Mhm.
it did happen. But
Yeah,
exactly why they would want to come from West Africa to the south of England, we don't know. So there are a lot of unanswered questions about these kinds of this kind of information. Recently, for example, there was a big fuss in the House of Commons about a report that has been written on some skeletal remains from the 14th century. That's the time of what is called the Black Death in Europe, which wiped out
yeah,
a large percentage of the population in Europe at that time.
yeah.
And some of the burials that have been found in London, there again, the archaeologists have analyzed the DNA and found that some people were of African heritage. And for some reason, this led to questions being asked in Parliament. I don't know why. Why should raise a question in Parliament? Some people just refuse to believe the evidence that's in front of them.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of information we have. It's kind of sketchy. There is some written information. There are various things that people can point to. But the information before the late 15th century is kind of sketchy. So in the book, I present all that we have, all that we know. And the point I make is this is really, kind of the tip of the iceberg. As more and more people investigate that period, which is a very, very long period, you see, not very many people investigate these things. There are not very
Okay.
many historians who work on these subjects. And so
So with
that information.
yeah.
When we come to later period like the Tudor period, so the early 16th century, for example, late 15th, early 16th century, then we have much more information to go on.
So with these archaeologists and anthropologists that are looking for these, the skeletal remains, or they're looking for the data, do you think it could be, is many of this, would you say, suppressed
Well,
information?
that's what the article about the remains of people in the Black Death was actually about. The people who wrote it said that archaeologists in general, first of all, archaeologists don't very often or don't do DNA analysis on everything that they find. And the article was saying that because the kind of common thinking is that Africans or people of African heritage aren't there, then people don't look for their presence.
Yeah.
And if people had a more open mind and actually did the investigation, did the analysis, then it's likely that more evidence would come to light. We have to remember that in this period, so I'm talking from the 8th century up until the end of the 15th century, parts of Europe, Spain, Portugal, were actually occupied by North Africans.
Yeah.
Or people from North Africa, and people from North Africa can include a whole variety of people. So that's a very, very long time. So 800 years. And so it's very, very likely, because as you mentioned earlier, there's such a strong contact between Spain, Portugal, and North Africa. They're so close to each other that probably many people from North Africa, as we know, they can come to Spain and Portugal, then it's not very difficult to come to Britain. So it's likely that we're going to find more information as people do the investigation. And what we have at the moment are just little glimpses of people, a few skeletons here and there, one or two mentions of people referred to as Saracens, for example, we find in the records. Or sometimes people referred to as Ethiopians in the records. But these are very, very few and far between, these references. So as more work is done, I would expect there to be much more information, much more evidence.
It's amazing how we always have to like chase up history. Now I understand there's some Europeans who will be honest about it. It's not only just people of our descent that speak the truth. I've learned off of many different Europeans who just spoke the truth. So see, like you've got the time of the Moorish period, and then you've got the time of the Punic Wars in Carthage, and then obviously you could deal with the Phoenicians. So there was what really in the last maybe, because they say the Phoenician period that was a lot earlier than the Punic Wars, when they were coming to Cornwall for copper, tin, so it seems like, and also these were navigators, so it's showing you that like we've been undermined, that we weren't able to navigate the seas, and we knew the currents of the ocean, because there's a lot of we seem to get this all the time. It's impossible how African people didn't know how to navigate the seas, and I think when you undermine people all the time, it just writes out possibilities all the time.
Yeah, and there's no reason to, there's no reason to write these things out. Well,
yeah,
there's a reason maybe for some people to write them out from our point of view. But you're right. Those connections between Europe, North Africa, and Cornwall, Europe, North Africa, and Southeast England. Some people even say that the word Thanet is a North African word. So these are speculative things, that you can talk about. People talk about the African conquest of Ireland, and if you look at the history of England, or whatever it's called, by Geoffrey of Monmouth, which was written in the medieval period, he has a whole section, which I write in my book, about how Africans conquered Ireland, and then they came to England, and they fought against the Saxons and so on. But these things are not, we don't have any other corroborative evidence of this. This is just one particular source. And for historians generally, we like to have, different types of evidence to substantiate something. But where there's information, I present it in the book. And as I say, Geoffrey of Monmouth is one of those early historians of Britain or England. And so I include that information in my book as well.
Well, interesting when you mentioned about Ireland as well. If there's a comparison that I can make, and I've traveled many places around the world, and what I've found is like the oldest people always seem to be small, diminutive black people, sort of like the Twa, the Pygmies. So everywhere I go, even people have, even if it's in a creation story, like even in the Hawaiian Islands, they spoke of small black people that were there. New Zealand spoke about it. Now, as far as evidence based, when I went into Southeast Asia and visited all these indigenous tribes in the rainforest, these are like 8 hour drives, like in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. They're all very small, diminutive people, and they will kind of resemble the pygmies of Congo, the Baka people of Cameroon. And then I'm reading stories about the dwarfs in Ireland. So I started trying to make comparisons, even reading Sheikh Anta Diop's book. There's about three of them I've read of his, and he was speaking of an oral history of some of the West African people, saying when they entered West Africa, these regions, there was only small pygmy type people. So it starts to make me think now. These people must have been everywhere, and he also mentioned about when people entered Western Asia, like African during the Sumerian period, there was Negrito type of black people. When they say Negrito, they were mean like the small diminutive black peoples, what they called them in Asia. So have you came across any comparisons of the diminutive short black people in your
No,
research?
no.
Because some of
Not
them are oral
in
history.
regard to Britain, no,
Yeah,
no.
right, okay. Interesting though. I mean, some are just oral history, and some of them, yeah, you will still see these people alive today. Most of them are in Asia, the Highlands of New Guinea, even in Tasmania. So there's some that are still surviving populations. But
Well, I mean,
interesting.
yeah, it's quite possible that, I mean, if you go back far enough, there are all kinds of possibilities. But I don't know that information in detail. So
Yeah.
I tend to stick to what I know something about.
Well, interesting what you were saying about the Saxons, like when Africans came to Ireland and then made their way to England and they were fighting with the Saxons. This is interesting. It's very
Well,
interesting.
that's what Geoffrey of Monmouth says. He talks about Gorman, king of the Africans, who came and plundered England and all this kind of thing. So I don't think there's any other evidence that I'm aware of, but there is that um, narrative. So, as I say, I present it without really being able to say very much more about it.
So hopefully as time goes on, more information. Do you think it's down to technology or do you think it's down to we need more researchers in
Well,
in
we
these
need more
areas?
researchers. We need more
Okay.
researchers. I have one of my PhD students. This is the area she wants to look at: early British history. But there are very, very few people working on it. So this is why we need all those measures to encourage people to take up history in a serious way. Do the research. You know, it's the same as any other area of history or any other field of history. If we don't do the work, then you know, we don't have the information, we don't have the evidence, and then the narrative which has been presented over the years, which tends to write people of African heritage out of the history of Britain, as well as out of the history, even out of the history of Africa, definitely out of the history of Britain, then
Yeah.
that is the kind of prevailing narrative, and that has to be attacked. You know, my books, even my children's book, you know, they're attacked. There are people, you know, these racists on YouTube who attack my books and
Yeah.
say I'm brainwashing people and all this kind of thing. And this is simply for presenting evidence. So
Yeah.
I'm always very, very careful what I say, what I present, that it can be substantiated and so on. We don't need to, you know, to make up stories or to tell lies about things. We just want the evidence to be presented. So where I have that evidence, I present it, and if people don't like it, that's tough.
That's tough. Like you said, of course, you're presenting evidence. What more do they need? You know, when we seen Cheddar Man come on the news, you know, a lot of Brits weren't happy, you know, so but at the end of the day, some people I was listening to some of the arguments and you had like people there he was saying, well, they're trying to steal our indigenous rights, and it's just pathetic, though.
Yeah, see, people don't understand that everybody. I mean, if we go back to Cheddar Man was a migrant. Everybody who comes to Britain is a migrant. You know, the Romans were migrants, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Normans, everybody's a migrant. So this kind of idea about indigenous, what does that mean? Who's indigenous? Is Cheddar Man, they're talking about Cheddar Man? Cheddar Man is the oldest physical existence of a British person.
Yeah.
And he was an immigrant from somewhere else. So I don't know what this indigenous history is. It's, it's a kind of myth that people need to. But I mean, these characters are just racists. I mean, that's, so they're anything which presents the history of Africans in Britain or people of color more generally, they're going to take an objection to it. I mean, it's not based on any concern for history in that sense.
Now, another interesting thing, when I've had Robin Walker on my show a couple of weeks ago, and we were having a discussion of black presence in Europe we were dealing with. So what I was explaining is where do the Indo-Europeans, the Indo-Europeans that we know today, where did they come from before entering Europe? Now, obviously, there's the sources of in the Caucasus Mountains, Central Asia's come up, and Central Europe before they actually moved completely in. So, have you made any references yourself where they were before they came, places like England and?
No, because I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But Cheddar Man is a good example. Is Cheddar Man a European? Everybody in Europe looked like Cheddar Man. So does that make them Europeans? So you see, it depends on how you look at these things. Cheddar Man was British or was European or whatever word you want to say. And everybody in Europe looked like that.
Yeah, that's it.
So we can see how,
environmental change
many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, people's appearance has gradually changed. And he had dark skin and dark hair, but blue eyes.
That's right, yeah.
So maybe eyes change faster than skin color, hair color, and so on. Anyway, these are things for anthropologists to be concerned about. My concerns are very, very, very simple. So I stick to what I'm concerned with.
Interesting. I remember last time we had a discussion about tribes, and you were saying you don't really use that term tribes. It's more brought in by the Europeans in Africa, the tribe thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just what does it mean? What?
Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. Like from young, I was just told I'm an Ijaw tribe of Nigeria. I know you have Nigerian descent. I think what's your tribe? Well, what's the? I don't even like to use the word. You see. So,
this is the issue that when we come to the history of Africa, which is another thing that I focus on and research and work on, we always come up against the kind of Eurocentrism which has surrounded the study of that continent, because in the modern period anyway, for the last 200 years, the study of that continent has been conducted by, in general, not totally, but in general, by people who have a very narrow perspective. We can say a Eurocentric perspective. It doesn't really matter where they come from. Well, they could be from Europe or they could be from Africa, but they very often have the same perspective. So, one only has to look at how, for example, the history of Egypt has been presented, or the history of any part of the African continent.
Yeah.
And it's only a few years ago people were saying Africa has no history and all this kind of thing. So we're also presented with, their terminology, their way of thinking about things. So if you say that, the Yoruba, for example, or the Zulu are a tribe, so then why are the English not a tribe? Or the French or the Spanish?
Yeah.
So my point is you have to use the same terms. If you think the English are a nation, which people would generally say the English are a nation because they've got, they've got a geographical territory, they've got a national culture, they've got a national language, they've got all the features of a nation. So then how is that different from a Yoruba or
That's right.
Egypt or
Yeah,
Zulu or Bambara or whoever it might be? They're all nations. So let's have consistency. If we want to call the Zulu or Yoruba a tribe, fine. Then let's call the English a tribe.
that's
But
it.
you see, tribe does have certain meaning because, we can talk about a type of organization of people who generally are all related by kinship. A tribe can have a very specific meaning of a type of social organization that is governed in a very particular way and so on. But the Yoruba are not governed in that way. The English are not governed in that way. So we don't use tribe to.
I did interview a Nigerian professor, and when I used the word tribe, he said he's a Yoruba, and he said no, ethnic group. That's what he considered
Yeah, but
himself.
why are the English an ethnic group?
Yeah, that's
You
it.
see, because the other thing about nations is that nations have rights,
Yeah,
including the right to self-determination. So at the moment, everyone's talking about Palestinians.
yeah,
So the Palestinians are a nation, and as a
that's it.
nation, they have the right to statehood. They have the right to self-determination, to decide their own future, just like the English or the French or whoever. But they're being denied that right. So these words that we use to talk about, peoples, nations are very, very important. The Irish are a nation, but this nation is divided by the British into two. Why should it be divided into two?
Yeah,
So, but when you say, if you use other terms to describe people, then it also affects how they're treated as well. And that's very true in Africa, where generally nations don't have rights. They don't have the right to determine their own affairs. Sometimes their languages are denied or about to disappear, whatever it might be. So these are very important questions. And we find that in the African continent, many nations are divided by the colonial boundaries. Sometimes people are forced to speak English, other people are supposed to speak French or whatever it might be. It's created all kind of problems. So these are very, very important issues to my mind, and the words we use have a meaning to them. And tribe is usually applied to people who are not Europeans. So it has a kind of derogatory, denigrating kind of characteristic to it.
yeah.
That's another reason why, like, oh, these are kind of less civilized people, they're somehow, they're not the same level as Europeans and so on. No, everybody's the same, has the same qualities. And
Well,
so there's no reason
it,
to use a different word to speak about the French or the English or the Spanish.
mm,
The word you use to speak about the Zulu, the Yoruba, the Soninke, the Bambara, the whoever it might be, they're the same. They're
yeah,
equal. There's equality in that sense.
that's it. Well, the interesting thing, well, I've been having a lot of discussions lately with some people. Been having discussions on like the state of Africa today, for example. Now it was a sort of a case of like who's to blame. Now I've got my views, other people have their views. I was wondering what your views on it. For example, up to date now, some people look at it as look, it's just corrupt African leaders, and they're basically ruining everything for everyone, greedy leaders. And then you'll see another side saying, no, the colonial powers are still intact in many ways due to wanting the resources of Africa. I'm wondering, like, what are your views on like today's politics in Africa, where some people look at it like it's Africa is really free, but we have corrupt leaders, and then some see we're not free because we still deal with colonial powers. I was just wondering what your views were on it.
Uh, well, if we look at Africa today, we can see that um, it's not genuinely independent in the sense that the interests of the majority of people of Africa are not put in first place. So if we take, say we take Nigeria, for example, which is the, whatever you want to say, is either the biggest or the second biggest economy in the whole of Africa. You know, is an major oil producer, has this, it has that, it has that. So how is it possible that you have a major oil producer, the biggest economy in Africa, but it's unable to provide electricity to its citizens, or it's unable to provide water to its citizens, or it has one of the biggest percentage of illiterate people in the world, and so on? This is because of the way the country is organized, and you know, you can see it, for example, in the bleeding of the country by, you know, a company like Shell. So Shell takes Nigeria's oil wealth, makes, you know, millions or billions, if you go take it all over the years from it, and gives those partners that it's dealing with in the Nigerian government or one or two other people a little, you know, backhand. I mean, a big backhand.
Yeah.
Because they can afford to give millions. And then the majority of people in the country haven't got any kerosene, haven't got any electricity supply, and so on. So that gives you an example. And when somebody protests about Shell, like Ken Saro-Wiwa did, the government, the Nigerian government will come along and kill them. So that tells you everything that you need to know about the nature of, you know, independence and so on. If we look at other areas, you know, DR Congo, for example, has been almost in continuous war since, you know, the 1990s for the last 30 years. And there are other places. So, you know, that's why we talk about the new scramble for Africa, that all the big powers are squabbling, fighting, contending over its resources, as well as over its markets, its population, and so on. And they tend not to fight themselves, but they fight in Africa using various proxies, which is what we see going on in Congo and so on. So this is what's going on. You know, in 1945 in Manchester, there was the famous Fifth Pan-African Congress, which was attended by people like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, many, many others. And at that Congress, they had a vision of a new Africa. And they identified three main things which they wanted to change. One, they said we want no colonial borders. Two, they said we want no, what they called alien political institutions. In other words, Africa must have its own political systems. And thirdly, they said we don't want the monopoly of capital, the capital-centered system. That was their demand. They said we'll fight for it and blah, blah, blah. So here we are, wherever we are, 70 odd years later, 80 years later, near enough. And we still have colonial boundaries. We still have the alien political institutions, a similar kind of political system that exists in Britain or the US or France or wherever. We still have the capital-centered system, which allows the big banks, the big multinational companies to suck all the wealth out of the African continent and so on and so forth. So if we still have all those things intact, which were intact in 1945, how can we talk about it being independent? And of course, when you have that economic system, which is corrupt everywhere, it allows the big banks, the big multinationals to encourage corruption within African countries. And of course, you have people in wherever, Nigeria or wherever country, who pocket billions.
Yeah.
Well, they have so much money. What can they do with it? How many cars can you drive? How many houses can you live in?
Yeah.
But they have all this, whereas you have people who have next to nothing. You know, millions of people living on less than $2 a day. So this is the problem that confronts us. And when you have countries that try and do something a little bit different, Libya, for example, then the British government, the US government, the French government, you know, impose sanctions. And if they don't work, then they invade, topple the government, kill the leaders.
This is something
that's the situation, and that's what needs to be, you know, has to be dealt with.
Yeah, people need to have this understanding of this though, because some people just look at it like, well, it's the African leaders being corrupt and the greed. Now, fear, obviously, when they have someone who's in part like a Western puppet, basically, you have puppets there who just go along with the system. Now, some of these puppets, of course, they like money, a lot of money, greed, but at the same time, the fear factor must be always there as well because they've seen what's happened to previous leaders.
Yeah, but you can't say people are, people are feared or people are afraid of becoming a millionaire or billionaire. You either go down that road or you say, I don't want to go down that road. Once you accept you know, the 40 pieces of silver, then you've made your choice in life.
That's it.
So I don't think anyone was going to feel sorry for somebody who takes that stand. People have more sympathy with those who, stand up against
Yeah,
the big powers, whether they're a Gaddafi or a Mugabe or a Nasser or whoever they are. At least they take a stand and say, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something which is in the interest of the people of Africa. And if they do that, then they'll have the support of people. Once I was at a meeting in Africa and I can't remember who it was. I think it was Museveni, the Ugandan president,
okay.
gave a public speech where he said this was when George Bush, one of the Bushes, I can't remember which one it was, George Bush was president. And Museveni made a public statement. He said when he goes to see George Bush, he feels like a schoolboy going to see his headmaster. Well, how can a president of a country in Africa talk like that publicly or feel
That's
like? Because if you have the support of everybody in your country, you would go to Bush and you tell him whatever you want to tell him. But because he has no support, he's just like you say, he's just like a, kind of puppet and, someone doing the bidding of others. He goes in this kind of, supplicant state to, the president of the US. So what we need is African leaders who stand up to these people. And if they're united, who is going to be able to say anything to them? But that unity is not there because they have other interests. Their interests are lining their pockets. Their interests are, somewhere else, not in defending the interests of the people. How can you be a politician in Nigeria and people
yeah,
don't have electricity and water? I
that's
mean,
it.
what kind of person can you be that you
Exactly.
cannot produce that? I
Exactly.
know where.
Yeah, so like we were saying before, it's interesting when we're speaking about the independence of Africa and what is really independent. And like you were saying, we've got all these, it's like you were speaking on Nigeria, we've got Shell, it's big corporations and it's never that simple. So if we look at solutions now we can look at Africa, but we can also look at Africans of the diaspora with what we call a Pan-African connection, which unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't always impact the way we like it to impact. But what are some of the solutions you think that we can do from whether we in the diaspora or in the mother continent?
Well, I think, I mean, if we look back to the last century and how people organize, um, there was obviously much more organizing at kind of what we could call kind of grassroots level. And so I think that's important today, even from the point of view of discussing what the solutions are and how to bring them about. So I think that's one of the things that's very, very important to actually, people to discuss together, work out the kind of things that need to be done, and then try and put them into operation. And what the last 70 or so years have taught us, 60 or 70 years have taught us, is that you can't just take hold of the existing structures and think they're going to work in your interests, whether it's the political system or the economic system. they're not, or even the colonial boundaries, as I said before, these things are not going to work in your interest. So you need to actually think about new systems of governance, new ways of organizing people, ways in which ordinary people become the decision makers, can empower themselves, and so on. And that also starts at the ground, it starts at the bottom. And developing ways of putting that into practice, of organizing people. And as I said in 1945, you need to organize those who produce the wealth, the workers, the farmers. These are the people that need to be organized. And of course, that has to be done on the continent, but there are also things that people here can do, or in other places can do, in terms of organizing, in terms of even, summing up the history. What is the history of the last 60, 70 years? Where have there been successes? So often we talk about some of the great leaders. For example, this year is the anniversary of Amilcar Cabral, one of the greatest freedom fighters in the recent history of Africa. But what is the importance of Cabral? What did he do? What did he say? Who knows about what he stood for, what he tried to do, and so on? So even providing that information and thinking about what needs to be done, where have there been successes, where have people made breakthroughs, and encouraging people to develop that work further, because there have been successes as well as setbacks. So building on those successes, and one of the key things is that it's the people who must decide, who must find ways of empowering themselves, of developing new ways of doing things, new ways of making decisions. So I think having that kind of discussion, subjecting the existing systems which are really preventing people having that, being empowered, that's also very important, because we find a lot of people complaining, well, the issue is, we don't have enough. We don't have enough entrepreneurs. We don't have enough people making money. We don't have whatever, all these things. But that's, in a way, kind of part of the problem. It's not that we don't have that. It's that people aren't the decision makers. So, as I said, I think summing up all that recent history, learning from it, and then putting it into practice is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be done.
Yeah. Well, one last question just before we go. Now, even though some people from the diaspora don't follow the history and don't understand what's going on, and even people in Africa, sometimes they don't know what's going on. Now, when we have, like, for example, the Chinese, in many parts of Africa, and they do a lot of great things in Africa as well, which help. But now, where do you see, some people could see the Chinese as they will be the next colonizers, and they'll deal with the corrupt leaders at the same time. I mean, anyone who's corrupt, obviously, people are going to work to benefit their country, of course. Where do you see the Chinese, and is it the fact of, like, they're just doing business and for their own interest, and rather than any type of friendship?
Well, I think the key thing is that the China is part of the scramble. And I spoke earlier about the new scramble for Africa. And one of the biggest contentions within that scramble is between China and the older colonial powers, Britain, France, and so on, but particularly the US. And the US has its army in Africa. AFRICOM is based, the Africa Command of the US Army is in Africa. It occupies, I don't know how many countries, nearly 20 countries where it has bases, principally to deal with the threat of China. And that's an economic threat mainly, but also, Chinese troops have increasingly begun to penetrate the continent, the Chinese Navy, and so on. So whether you think that China is for good or ill, I mean, that's another issue that can be gone into. It's definitely part of the scramble. You could say if, the Chinese are building a road or a railway or a port, that might be a good thing. Just as in the past, the Europeans built railways and ports. Was that a good thing? I'm not sure. Infrastructure
Okay.
can be a good thing, but what is it part of? That's the
Yeah.
question. And is it enabling Africans to decide their own futures? And when I say Africans, I don't just mean governments. I mean the majority of people to decide their futures. But China is definitely part of the scramble.
Yeah.
With all the other big powers. And those powers are increasing because you have the BRICS, you have Russia, you have India, you now have Turkey, you have some of the Gulf states, you have Indonesia. So there are many different countries competing for Africa's resources, and that is problematic. And we have to remember also that the first scramble for Africa's colonies at the end of the 19th century led directly to the First World War. So
Yeah.
the scramble is the contention which exists is extremely dangerous. For African countries like DR Congo, which has been part of that scramble for the last nearly 30 years, over 30 years, it's led to the deaths of millions of people.
Yeah.
And so it's a scramble which is a very bad thing for Africa and for the African continent, and needs to be, Africans need to unite to find a way through that, a way out of that, and a way to liberate themselves from all these contending big powers in the continent.
Interesting you mentioned about BRICS as well, because some people look at like, oh, this is the new thing that's going to be great for everyone going against Western powers, but it's just going to be enough. It's just part of the scramble, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the BRICS obviously also includes South Africa,
Yeah, well,
but you see, the thing is that whose interest, again, you see, you have things in Africa like people are talking about a new free trade zone in Africa, like the whole African continent should be a free trade zone, which is basically what the EU is.
yeah, yeah,
So does the EU benefit the people of Europe? Well, no, it doesn't. So having a free trade zone in Africa, will it benefit the majority of Africans? Well, no, it won't. History tells us. We know what the EU did for Europe.
yeah,
The EU favored the big monopolies of the big countries in Europe, the
yeah.
British, the French, the Germans, to some
Do you
extent, all the
think?
Germans in particular. So these things, when you have this economic system, this capital-centered system, which is all about making money for a few people, it's never going to be for the benefit of the majority of people. And that's who
Yeah,
we need to be concerned about.
yeah. I mean, do you reckon a borderless Africa would be better, where we don't need African don't need a passport to travel different places, rather than just
Well,
only
it's better than yeah. I mean,
yeah,
if it, but the thing is,
if there's unity.
it's being conducted for other purposes.
It's all about the purposes, you're right.
And the
Yeah,
EU is the same. They used to talk about freedom of movement and all this kind of thing, but it's in whose interests are these things? The
definitely.
big monopolies. They freedom of movement is good from them when they get labor supply, they get whatever they need. But it's not done in the interests of the majority of people. Okay, yeah, maybe you can go into whatever, go on your holiday to Spain or something without a visa, but
Yeah,
um, you have to look at the whole package. Of course, it's great if Africans can travel around the continent and those in the diaspora can travel around the continent
yeah,
without the need for visas and so on, of course. But again, as I say, you have to look at the bigger picture, what's actually going on.
definitely. Well, I want to thank you very much anyway, Professor Hakim. I think it's been a
You're
pleasure.
welcome.
Very
You're welcome.
enjoyable discussion, and got a few things that I needed to talk about, and I was only discussing some of these things today, and I said, watch now when I get the next professors on, we're going to be touching on these topics. So thank you very much anyway, and I
You're
look
very
forward
welcome.
to following your work anyway, and it's a pleasure, and I'll see you again. Uh,
You
you
certainly
have a
will.
good
Yeah.
day. Thank you
Take
very
it easy.
much.
Yeah.
You take it
Thanks.
easy.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
weekend. Yeah. Bye bye.
You too. Best.